So everyone seems to be pretty clued up and pretty comfortable with what is happening for number one. We just have our labor, we have our labor market plotting real wage against quantity of labor. We have our labor demand. We have our labor supply. And we have our production function underneath. We have some equilibrium quantity of labor. So plotting labor against output, we have some level of output. So if we call this L0, we call this L0, and we call this Y0. Then when we increase our population, what happens? Increased population, labor supply. Labor supply shifts to the right. Equilibrium is to the right of our initial level of equilibrium. And we have a higher level of employment. So labor employed is now at level L1. And output increases from output level Y1 to output level, from output level Y0 to output level Y1. So that was fairly straightforward. Number two, a little bit more complicated, but everyone seemed to be happy with that as well. Same setup, so we've got our labor demand, downward sloping, labor supply, upward sloping, plotting labor against real wage with a production function below. We know that labor demand is a function of labor productivity, which means that when labor productivity changes, we have a shift in labor demand and we have a shift in the production function. So, if infrastructure gets destroyed, that's the same as saying capital is being destroyed or capital is decreasing. When capital decreases, labor becomes less productive. So what do we end up with? Labor demand shifts to the left. Okay. We employ less people, so quantity of labor shifts from L0 down to, let's call it L2. Okay. But that change in productivity also shifts our production function. It lowers our production function. So we move to a lower level of output. Call it Y2, and Y2 corresponds to the level of employment, L2, and to a lower production function. Our production function shifted from PF0 to PF, let's just call that 2. So LD from LD0 to LD2. And our labor supply shifted from LS1 from LS0 to LS1. Okay. So chapter 23 ends off with quite a detailed discussion on different growth theories. So it begins with a discussion on the classical theory of growth. So the classical theory of growth traces back to Adam Smith, Thomas Malthus, David Ricardo, and is often the idea, the central idea that arises from classical growth theory is that growth in real GDP leads to growth in standards of living. And with a growth in standard of living comes a growth in human reproductive rates. Okay? So in other words, the richer people are, the more kids they tend to have, and the better those kids tend to survive into adulthood. Okay? So with more money comes better health care, comes better nourishment comes better safety. Yeah. So we'll get to that. Yeah. Okay. And then a point was raised just now, which we'll get to, which is a good point. So the idea was, remember, classical growth theory comes from the 1700s. You don't have things like antibiotics. Okay. You don't have things like basic medicinal science of any sort. Okay? So when you have low production, you have a lot of poverty. As soon as productivity increases, people start earning a little bit more, and as soon as they start earning more, and bear this in mind as well, it's the 1700s. You don't spend your money on an Xbox. You don't spend your money going to the theater. Like, you have a certain amount of spare time, and in your spare time, you have limited numbers of things you can do for entertainment, right? So you don't have things like contraceptives. So, you fall pregnant, you have a kid, you're probably going to fall pregnant. If you are married, if you are a lady of the night, you're probably going to fall pregnant as well. And when you have children, they are probably going to die from something like, diphtheria or anything that we think of as being completely arbitrary today. Polio, measles, any other kind of, a cold, exactly. Die of the flu. So your chances of surviving beyond the age of 5 is pretty minimal. And your chances of being well nourished are pretty minimal too. So as soon as people get more money, they spend it on more food. And by spending it on more food, they have better health care. They have better antibodies. They just, survive better. So your population increases. And with that increase in population, the argument goes, any gains from productivity essentially just get spread across a bigger population. And so you sort of just tend towards the same level of poverty overall. Okay? In other words, the only thing that halts population growth is poverty. That's the story of the classical growth theory. As soon as you have growth, you have increasing population, and that increasing population just tends to the same poverty level it was before. Okay? Why was this the idea? Well, you can see it today, in fact. So another name for this classical growth was kind of Malthusian Theory. So you have modern-day Malthusians. You can recognize this, I'm sure. Why would we not just have better healthcare and better awesomeness with economic growth? Well, because we're going to run out of resources. You can't just keep on growing all the time. You run out of resources. That was the Malthusian story. As your population grows, so they start consuming more things like farm products, there are less, there's only so much farmland, there's only so much, with the level of farming technology is only at a certain level. All of that extra food will just be distributed between more people, and everyone ends up with the same level of food that they had before. Okay? Maybe there's an increase in farming technology, you start growing more food, you end up with a higher population, and more food getting distributed amongst more people means same level of food as you had before. You're going to run out of resources. That was the argument. So any increase in growth leads to an increase in population, and that increase in population then leads to a decline, and we return to primitive standards of living. So the modern story would be something like, well, we have global warming, we have limited oil stocks, the planet cannot cope with as many people as we have. Economic growth is going to lead everyone back to the same levels of poverty that we had in the 1800s. Climate change is going to wipe out crops. There's going to be global war. There's not going to be enough water. We're going to tend back to subsistence levels, essentially. Okay, so that's the modern day story. Well, sorry, the modern day version of a very old story. Then we had something called Neoclassical Growth Theory, associated primarily with this gentleman, Robert Solow. And this was in around the 50s, or maybe it started a bit earlier than the 50s, but reaches its zenith, I guess, in the 50s. The proposition that real GDP per person grows because technological change induces savings and, importantly, investment. And with investment, we have increases in capital, and increases in capital mean more capital per laborer. Okay? So capital per hour of labor grows. So the more capital we have, the more growth we have for our laborers. So what then drives growth? It's anything that drives increases in capital. So primarily, growth ends if technological change stops. So one of the things is, of course, as soon as you get a certain level of, not as soon as you get a certain level, but as you get more capital, the marginal returns to that capital diminish, which means your incentives to invest in that sort of capital diminishes. So as long as we have technological progress making us invest in new kinds of technologies and new kinds of capital, we can always grow without worrying too much about diminishing marginal returns. As soon as our technology stops advancing, our capital starts suffering from diminishing marginal returns and our growth rate starts falling, we start having a problem. So attached to the neoclassical growth theory was the neoclassical theory of population growth. So there was a population explosion in the 18th century in Europe, so towards the end of the 1700s and beginning of the 1800s as well. Again, you have this population growth. The classical guys are saying it's going to be no good. This increase in population is just going to lead everyone back into poverty. But we don't have that. What ends up happening? Well, the birth rate starts falling. And even though the population is increasing, it starts increasing at a very slow rate. And today, we see the wealthy countries of Europe and even some cities in Canada, some wealthy cities in the US as well, where population growth rates are declining. In other words, their populations are getting smaller. Japan, the population is getting smaller. Okay? So you had this massive growth, and you didn't have the prediction of the Malthusians that everyone would just return back to poverty. Why? Because we ended up having much lower population growth rates because people started having less kids. Contraception, as well as things like basically better family planning, changing family roles, and basically like the suffragette movement, which said that women were not beholden on men and were not there to just make babies for them. They could make their own choices about what they wanted to do with their bodies. So we didn't have the disaster that the Malthusians said was going to happen. Instead, we ended up having increasing standards of living. With our growth came increasing standards of living and more wealth. What we've also seen, as was noted earlier, is that in fact, where you've seen most growth in populations has been in poorer countries. Why have we seen growth in populations in those poorer countries? Well, what we've seen is better medical care. Okay? In other words, primarily what's happened is that children have not died under the age of 5. So death rates for children below the age of 5, in fact, there's awesome graphs I can show you with that as well. We can take a look just now. That show globally what has happened to the world's population in the last 200 years. It's fascinating. So population growth in poorer parts of the world has primarily been because of healthcare changes. And what we expect to see is that as wealth in those countries starts increasing, population growth rates start decreasing in those countries too. What we have seen is a lot of technological change, but we've also started seeing diminishing marginal returns. So the pace of technological change influences the economic growth rate, but economic growth does not influence the pace of technological change. We haven't seen constant technological change growth rates. Neoclassical growth theory says that prosperity will last, but the growth will not last unless technology keeps advancing. But there's been a problem with neoclassical growth theory, which is the following. All economies have access to the same technologies, and capital is free to roam the globe. But capital, so in terms of the theory, capital should flow from areas where there's lots of capital to areas where there's minimal capital. Okay? Because that's where you're going to get higher rates of return. But that's not what we've seen. We've seen that capital tends to bunch. Wealthy countries tend to have more investment in capital than poorer countries. So what's the problem then with that neoclassical growth theory? One of the problems that neoclassical growth theory does not take into account is political infrastructure. Things like property rights. In other words, you might want to invest capital in poor countries because of a good rate of return, but if you are not sure that you will in fact own the property that you invest in that economy, you're probably less likely to go and invest there. Okay? So there's one reason why the neoclassical growth theory has not yielded the kind of flow of capital that we might have expected. We then have something called the new growth theory. And the new growth theory is more sort of in the 1980s. Mostly due to Paul Romer. And what he says is that real GDP per person grows because of the choices that people make in the pursuit of profit, and that growth will persist indefinitely. Because the search for new technologies is driven by incentives. So essentially we have what's kind of like a perpetual motion growth economy. New growth theory sees economy as perpetual motion machine. No matter how rich we become, our wants always exceed our ability to satisfy them. So way back to microeconomics, remember this idea that we have unlimited wants but limited resources. And even though we can make our limited resources work in ways that generate more and more output, or they work more and more efficiently, that doesn't change the fact that we just want more and more stuff. So here we sort of have a diagram of what the new growth theory story would be, which takes into account more than just capital and labor, and starts thinking more about things, and this black box called technology, but also thinks about what drives technological change. What are the inputs into technological change? What drives the decisions that people make? Things like political economy. So if we compare the new growth theory versus, say, Malthus's theory, well, to Malthus, the population growth is part of the problem, whereas to the new growth theorist, population growth is part of the problem. It's part of the solution. The more people you have, the more ideas you have, the more innovative thinking you have, the more opportunity you have for technological advancement. And then we can sort of give a summary of what these different theories focus on. 1, 2, 3, and then finally there's a discussion on how we might want to achieve faster growth. So the summary of the classical, well, our physical resources are limited, and without advances in technology, we're going to hit diminishing marginal returns. And even when we have advances in technology, what ends up happening? Increases in population means that we have no real growth in standards of living. Neoclassical theory, well, it emphasizes that we do have diminishing returns to capital. It reminds us that we cannot keep growing just by accumulating capital, and that we definitely need advances in technology. So in other words, in this story, even if we have advances in physical capital without any kind of population growth, because of diminishing marginal returns, we're still going to hit a plateau where our real wealth just stops advancing. And the only way that we can increase it is if we have technological advancement. Whereas the new growth theory comes along and says, well, actually, the capacity of human resources to innovate often offsets any diminishing returns from capital. So even if we have diminishing returns to capital, and even if we have a population that is, not necessarily growing as fast as we want, as long as we can keep up a degree of, what can I say? Whatever. Like if a stone is rolling down a hill, it gets a certain speed, and then you can't stop it. What am I talking about? Velocity, I guess. Okay. So as long as your economy reaches a certain velocity, there's a kind of continuous advancement that will happen just from everyone learning and doing what they're doing, right? So there's a kind of a perpetual motion that can happen as long as your economy gets to a certain kind of velocity with enough people and enough capital in it. It can then kind of become self-sustaining. Okay? Then when you have things like population growth, that's not a problem because the more resources we add just means we have more resources to invest in more and more technological advancement. Okay? So what are the sort of policies that we think of at this point in time that lead towards growth? So this is kind of a different take, essentially, on Neil Ferguson's discussion. So he had the 6 killer apps. These are similar. So the first thing says to stimulate saving. In other words, saving finances investment, so stimulating saving increases growth. So as long as we can get people to save, we can get people to invest, and people investing increases capital. Stimulate research and development. In other words, research and development is what fuels technological advance. So we need that. Improve education. Provide international aid to developing nations. Also encourage international trade. You saw in microeconomics why international trade is good for an economy. Similar thing would have been said by Neil Ferguson in terms of competition. Competition generates growth, investment generates growth, education, which links to research and development, and research and development is linked to things like scientific technologies. So there's a lot of overlap between what he was saying and what we've got at the end of the textbook here. To finish off today then, what I think will look really cool is, see if we can find it.